Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where temperatures drop to 40 below zero, Jake Morrison watches the weather forecast with growing dread. The worst blizzard in decades is heading straight for his remote animal sanctuary, and his heating system just died. 43 rescued animals, wolves, bears, and exotic cats that no one else would take, depend on him to keep them alive through the night. But Jake isn't just any animal lover. He's a former NASA thermal engineer who was blacklisted 5 years ago for proposing a heating theory so radical his colleagues called it stupid and impossible. Now, as the storm closes in and conventional heaters fail, Jake faces an impossible choice. Let his animals freeze to death or prove his critics wrong using a technique so unconventional it defies everything the scientific community believes about heat transfer. The stakes couldn't be higher. These aren't just animals, they're witnesses to something Jake discovered in those mountains, something powerful people would kill to keep secret. But will his stupid heating trick actually work when lives are on the line? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's breath crystallized in the frigid air as he knelt beside the massive heating unit, its dead bulk mocking him. The generator had been his lifeline for 3 years, ever since he'd transformed this abandoned mining facility into a sanctuary for animals the world had given up on. Now its silence felt like a death sentence. A low growl echoed from the far enclosure where Sasha, a 700-pound Siberian tiger, paced restlessly. She'd been rescued from an illegal trafficking ring 2 years ago, and like all his animals, she carried scars both visible and hidden. The tiger's amber eyes seemed to understand the gravity of their situation as she watched Jake through the reinforced fence. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the converted mining tunnels that served as animal quarters. Jake had chosen this location carefully, not just for its remoteness, but for what lay buried 300 feet below in the abandoned shafts. The crystalline formations he'd discovered down there defied known physics, generating heat through some mechanism that had cost him his career when he'd tried to publish his findings. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert, blizzard warning extended. Wind speeds 80+ mph, life-threatening conditions. The storm was arriving 6 hours ahead of schedule. Jake's mind raced through conventional options. The backup generator was too small to heat the entire facility. The wood-burning stoves could warm maybe 2 enclosures at most. Propane heaters were dangerous around the animals and wouldn't last through a 3-day storm. Every solution fell short of saving all 43 lives under his care. That left only one option, the one that had made him a laughingstock at NASA. He jogged toward his workshop, past enclosures housing a pack of Arctic wolves whose howls harmonized with the wind, and a family of spectacled bears that clustered together sensing the approaching danger. Each animal had come to him broken in some way, rejected by traditional zoos or sanctuaries, just like Jake himself. In his workshop, buried beneath stacks of technical manuals and failed heating prototypes, lay a metal case he hadn't opened in 5 years. His hands trembled from cold or fear, he couldn't tell, as he entered the combination. Inside, wrapped in specialized foam, were 12 crystalline rods that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. He discovered them during his final NASA project, studying thermal dynamics in extreme environments. The crystals generated heat through quantum resonance, a process his department head had called fantasy physics. When Jake insisted the phenomenon was real, measurable, and revolutionary, they'd questioned his mental stability. When he'd refused to abandon his research, they'd destroyed his career. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same discovery which had made him unemployable might now be the only thing standing between his animals and death. Jake gathered the crystals and headed for the main heating chamber, a circular room at the sanctuary's heart where all the ventilation systems converged. His theory required precise placement. The crystals needed to be positioned at specific geometric intervals to create resonance feedback loops. One miscalculation could render them useless. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, but these weren't the gentle flakes of a normal storm. They came down hard and fast, driven by winds that screamed through the mountain passes. The temperature had already dropped 15 degrees in the past hour. As Jake worked, installing the crystals in a pattern that looked random but followed precise mathematical principles, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just the animals, something else, something human. Ever since he'd gone public with his research, certain government factions had taken an unhealthy interest in both him and his discoveries. His remote location had kept him safe, but storms had a way of forcing people into desperate situations. The final crystal clicked into place just as the lights flickered. Emergency power kicked in, bathing the chamber in an eerie red glow. Now came the moment of truth. Would 5 years of exile prove his critics right, or vindicate the most controversial theory in modern thermodynamics? Jake's finger hovered over the activation switch as the storm began its full assault on the mountain. Marcus Chen's hands trembled as he checked the thermometer mounted outside the main shelter. -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was picking up speed like a freight train gathering momentum. In his 7 years running the High Peak Animal Sanctuary, he'd weathered plenty of storms, but this one felt different, hungrier. The emergency radio crackled with static before the Weather Service's monotone voice cut through. Blizzard warning extended through Thursday morning. Wind speeds expected to reach 70 miles per hour. All residents advised to shelter in place. Thursday morning, that was still 36 hours away. Marcus pulled his wool cap lower and trudged through the deepening snow toward the main barn. Inside, 43 animals depended on him, everything from abandoned dogs and cats to a 3-legged elk named Ranger and 2 rescued black bears preparing for their winter sleep. The heating system was already running at maximum capacity, burning through propane faster than he'd budgeted for the entire month. The barn doors groaned against their hinges as he forced them open. Warm air rushed out to meet the bitter cold, and Marcus felt his stomach clench. They were bleeding heat faster than the system could generate it. "Hey there, Ruby," he murmured to a golden retriever mix who limped over on 3 legs. She'd been hit by a car 6 months ago, and the veterinary bills had nearly bankrupted the sanctuary. But looking into her trusting brown eyes, Marcus knew he'd make the same choice again. The other animals stirred restlessly in their enclosures. They could sense the approaching danger just as clearly as he could. The cats had clustered together in tight groups, while the dogs paced nervously. Even Ranger, usually calm and dignified despite his missing front leg, kept shifting his weight and snorting clouds of vapor. Marcus checked his phone for the 100th time that evening. No signal. The cell tower must have gone down with the first wave of the storm. He was truly isolated now, cut off from any possibility of evacuation assistance. Not that anyone would risk their lives in this weather anyway. He walked to the propane storage area and felt his heart sink. At the current burn rate, they had maybe 18 hours of fuel left. The storm would outlast their heat by almost a full day. As he stood there calculating impossible math, his eyes drifted to the locked steel cabinet in the corner of the barn. He'd installed it himself 3 years ago, telling himself it was just for storage. But he knew better. Behind that reinforced door lay the remnants of his former life, blueprints, components, and research notes from Project Prometheus. The heating technology he'd developed for Mars habitation domes was revolutionary. It could generate enough thermal energy to keep the barn comfortable for weeks, using nothing more than a car battery and some basic electrical components. The only problem was that it worked by manipulating quantum field fluctuations in ways that violated half the known laws of physics. NASA had buried the project after Marcus refused to weaponize the technology. They'd buried him along with it, destroying his reputation and career with accusations of falsified data and research misconduct. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Marcus had accidentally stumbled onto something that could change the world, and powerful people wanted it contained. A sharp crack echoed through the barn as a tree branch struck the roof. Ruby whimpered and pressed closer to his legs. Marcus knelt and scratched behind her ears, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a heavy blanket. "What do you think, girl? Should we break some laws of physics tonight?" She tilted her head, and Marcus could swear he saw understanding in her expression. These animals had already survived abandonment, abuse, and injuries that should have killed them. They deserved better than freezing to death because he was too paranoid to use the tools at his disposal. He pulled out his keyring and walked slowly toward the steel cabinet. Each step felt like a small betrayal of the promise he'd made to himself when he'd fled to these mountains. He would disappear. He would live simply. He would never again unleash forces he couldn't fully control or understand. But sometimes survival required compromise. The lock clicked open with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the barn's hushed atmosphere. Inside, wrapped in protective foam, lay the components of a device that could solve their heating crisis in minutes. It would also announce his location to anyone sophisticated enough to detect the unique energy signature it generated. Marcus lifted out the central processing unit, a device no larger than a laptop computer but containing processing power that wouldn't be commercially available for another decade. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over as he began assembling the system he'd hoped never to use again. Outside, the wind howled like something hungry and alive, shaking the barn walls with increasing violence. But inside, surrounded by animals who trusted him to keep them safe, Marcus Chen prepared to risk everything on an impossible solution. Sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only choice. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the reinforced windows of Marcus's cabin with such fury that he wondered if the glass might finally surrender. He stood at the main window, watching his rescue animals huddle together in their heated shelters, their breath visible even through the double-paned barrier separating him from the storm. The weather service had been wrong, dead wrong. What they'd predicted as a moderate snowfall had transformed into something meteorologists would later classify as a once-in-a-century blizzard. Already, 18 inches had fallen in the past 6 hours, and the temperature was plummeting faster than his heating systems could compensate. Marcus checked his tablet again, scrolling through the power consumption data. The backup generators were burning through fuel at an alarming rate, and the main electrical grid had failed an hour ago when a transformer somewhere down the mountain had given up under the weight of ice and wind. At this rate, he had maybe 8 hours before everything went dark and cold, 8 hours before the animals started dying. He pulled on his heaviest coat and fought his way through the connecting tunnel to the main shelter. The rescued wolves, a pack of 6 that had been illegally captured and abandoned by poachers, pressed against the heated walls, their yellow eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. In the adjacent enclosure, 3 black bears that should have been hibernating paced restlessly, their natural rhythms disrupted by their traumatic rescue. The heating units were working overtime, their fans whirring constantly, but Marcus could feel the cold creeping in through every microscopic gap in the insulation. The animals felt it too. The wolves had stopped their usual playful interactions and had formed a tight defensive circle. The bears had retreated to the warmest corner, but even there he could see them shivering. Back in his cabin, Marcus stared at his computer screen, running calculations he'd performed 1,000 times before. The math was unforgiving. Traditional heating wouldn't be enough. The generators wouldn't last. Even if he burned every piece of furniture in the cabin, it wouldn't generate sufficient heat to keep the larger shelters warm enough to prevent hypothermia in the animals. He needed a miracle. Or he needed to use the device. Marcus walked to the basement door, his hand resting on the handle for a full minute before he turned it. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the space he'd sworn he would never enter again. The basement was twice the size of the cabin above, carved directly into the mountain bedrock and lined with electromagnetic shielding that had cost him most of his NASA settlement money. In the center of the space sat his greatest achievement and his greatest shame, a cylindrical device roughly the size of a refrigerator, covered in precisely calibrated coils and connected to a control console that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft, which, in a way, it had. The Resonance Thermal Generator, his name for it, though NASA had called it Project Prometheus, could theoretically heat the entire mountain complex using nothing more than targeted quantum field manipulation. It drew energy from the zero-point field, the quantum foam that existed in all empty space, and converted it to usable thermal energy. On paper, it was impossible. In practice, it worked perfectly, too perfectly. The last time he'd activated it during the NASA trials, the device had worked exactly as designed. More than designed. It had generated so much heat that it had nearly melted through 3 feet of reinforced concrete before he could shut it down. The review board had classified the entire project and buried it so deep that officially it had never existed. Marcus ran his fingers along the control panel, muscle memory guiding him to switches and dials he hadn't touched in 3 years. The device hummed to life with a sound like distant thunder, and immediately he could feel warmth beginning to radiate from the thermal dispersal units he'd secretly installed throughout the complex. But as the temperature readings climbed, so did his anxiety. The last time, the device had worked perfectly right up until the moment it hadn't. The fail-safes had held barely, but the potential for catastrophic overload remained. If something went wrong here, in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard, there would be no emergency shutdown teams, no evacuation protocols, just him, the animals, and enough thermal energy to turn half the mountain into glass. Outside, the wind shrieked with renewed fury, as if nature itself sensed the unnatural warmth spreading through the complex. Marcus monitored the readouts obsessively, adjusting parameters by fractions of degrees, walking a tightrope between salvation and disaster. The animals began to settle as the temperature stabilized. The wolves sprawled out on the now comfortable floor of their enclosure, and the bears finally stopped their restless pacing. For now, they were safe. But Marcus knew that safety was an illusion. He had crossed a line he'd sworn never to cross again, and there would be consequences. There always were. In the distance, barely audible over the storm, he heard the sound of helicopter rotors. The thermometer outside Marcus's workshop read -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind hadn't stopped howling for 6 hours. Through the frosted window, he could barely make out the shadowy forms of the animal enclosures already half buried in drifting snow. The emergency generator coughed and sputtered, its fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. Marcus pulled his wool cap down over his ears and stepped into the main shelter, where dozens of animals huddled together for warmth. The injured hawk he'd rescued last week sat motionless on its perch, feathers puffed against the cold. 3 deer clustered near the failing space heater, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The bear cub, barely 6 months old and found orphaned near the highway, whimpered in the corner, its small body shivering despite the thick blankets Marcus had wrapped around it. "I know, little one," he whispered, kneeling beside the cub. "I know it's cold." He'd built this sanctuary with his own hands over the past 3 years, creating a refuge for injured wildlife that the state facilities couldn't accommodate. It was supposed to be his redemption, his way of giving back after everything had gone so spectacularly wrong in his previous life. Now it might become their tomb. The generator wheezed again, and the single functioning heater flickered. Marcus did quick calculations in his head. At this rate, they had maybe 2 hours before the backup power died completely. The main heating system had failed when a tree crashed into the power lines that morning, taking out electricity to his entire compound. His emergency supplies were running out, and the storm had made the mountain roads impassable. No rescue was coming. Marcus returned to his workshop and stared at the covered object in the corner, the thing he'd sworn never to use again. Beneath the heavy tarp lay 3 years of guilt and shame, wrapped in titanium and ceramic composites. The prototype that had ended his career and nearly killed 12 people. He yanked away the covering, revealing a device about the size of a small refrigerator. Its sleek surface bore no markings except for a small NASA logo that he'd never bothered to remove. The Quantum Thermal Amplifier, or as his former colleagues had mockingly called it after the accident, Brennan's folly. The technology was theoretically sound. By manipulating quantum field fluctuations at the molecular level, it could generate tremendous amounts of heat with minimal energy input. During laboratory tests, it had exceeded every efficiency metric, but when they'd scaled it up for the Mars habitat prototype, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The amplifier had overloaded, causing an explosion that collapsed half the testing facility and sent Dr. Sarah Chen to the hospital with third-degree burns. The investigation had blamed design flaws, insufficient safety protocols, and Marcus's reckless disregard for established procedures. His security clearance was revoked, his reputation destroyed. NASA terminated him, and no other aerospace company would return his calls. He'd retreated to these mountains to escape the whispers and pointed fingers, bringing the prototype with him, the only thing they'd let him keep from 15 years of research. Now, as another gust of wind rattled the workshop windows, Marcus ran his hands over the device's control panel. He'd spent months after the accident reviewing every line of code, every circuit design, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The error, when he finally found it, had been almost laughably simple, a reversed polarity in the containment field that created a feedback loop, an undergraduate mistake that had cost him everything. The fix would take 10 minutes to implement. He'd identified the problem within weeks of arriving in the mountains, but had never corrected it. The device was too dangerous, the memories too painful. Better to let it gather dust than risk another catastrophe. But now, listening to the wind and watching his breath turn to vapor in the increasingly cold workshop, Marcus felt the weight of different lives in his hands. The bear cub wouldn't survive another hour in these conditions. The injured hawk was already showing signs of severe hypothermic stress. The deer, the rabbits, the wounded fox recovering from surgery, all of them depended on him. He opened the device's maintenance panel and located the problematic circuit board. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the tiny components. The polarity switch was smaller than a pencil eraser, hidden behind a maze of other circuits. One wrong move could fry the entire system, or worse, recreate the conditions that had caused the original explosion. Outside, a tree branch cracked under the weight of ice and crashed to the ground with a thunderous boom. The animals in the shelter bleated and cried out in fear. The generator's cough became more pronounced, its rhythm increasingly erratic. Marcus held the micro tool steady and carefully reversed the polarity connection. The circuit board hummed softly as electrons found their proper paths. He closed the panel and stared at the activation switch, knowing that everything, his animals' lives, his own safety, perhaps his final chance at redemption, hung on whether he'd learned from his catastrophic mistake. The thermometer outside the barn read -18 degrees, and that was before the wind chill factor that Marcus knew could drive the effective temperature down another 20 degrees. He pulled his wool cap lower over his ears and checked his watch, 3:47 a.m. The storm had been raging for 6 hours now, and the emergency generator powering the barn's heating system was already showing signs of strain. Inside the converted aircraft hangar he called home, Marcus spread blueprints across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and a half-eaten sandwich. The plans showed a device he designed 3 years ago at NASA, before everything went wrong, before the cover-up, before his exile to these Colorado mountains. Back then they'd called it Project Helios, and it had been intended for Mars colonization. The prototype could generate enough heat to warm a small settlement using principles that mainstream physics considered theoretical at best. The wind howled against the metal walls, rattling loose panels and sending snow through gaps he'd never noticed before. In the barn, 43 rescued animals depended on him. Horses saved from slaughter, dogs pulled from fighting rings, cats from overcrowded shelters, and even a pair of elderly goats that had nowhere else to go. Their trust humbled him daily, but tonight it felt like a crushing weight. Marcus walked to a storage room he kept locked even from himself most days. His hands shook as he entered the combination, not from cold, but from the knowledge of what lay beyond that door. Inside, covered by military-grade tarps, sat the components of his life's work and his greatest shame. The resonance chambers, crystalline matrices, and quantum field generators that could revolutionize energy production or level a city block if mishandled. He'd stolen them the night before his dismissal, knowing that General Morrison would either weaponize the technology or bury it so deep that it would never see daylight. Neither option was acceptable. The official story painted him as a disgraced engineer who'd suffered a mental breakdown after his calculations failed. Only Marcus knew the truth. His calculations had worked too well. The barn's heating system gave a concerning groan, followed by a series of mechanical clicks that sounded like mechanical death rattles. Marcus grabbed his coat and flashlight, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the sound of frightened animals. Inside, his breath formed clouds despite the heaters running at maximum capacity. Duchess, an old mare with arthritis, stood shivering in her stall, while the smaller animals had huddled together for warmth. "Easy, girl," Marcus whispered, stroking Duchess's neck. Her coat felt cold to the touch, and he could see the stress in her eyes. Around the barn, similar scenes played out. Animals that had already suffered too much in their lives, now facing a night that could be their last. The main heater coughed once more, then fell silent. The sudden absence of its mechanical humming made the wind sound like a living thing trying to tear the building apart. Marcus's flashlight beam caught the frost already beginning to form on the water buckets. He calculated they had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia became a real threat to the smaller animals, 4 hours before it could kill them. He thought about the equipment in his storage room, about the warnings he'd received from faceless government agents who visited twice a year to ensure his continued silence. They'd made it clear what would happen if he ever used the technology again. But they'd also made it clear that Marcus Holloway was officially dead to the world, a man whose reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that nobody would believe him, even if he tried to tell his story. Back in his house, Marcus pulled on thermal gear and began hauling components from storage. The base unit alone weighed nearly 200 pounds, but adrenaline and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Snow stung his face as he loaded everything onto a reinforced cart, the wind trying to rip tools from his frozen fingers. The barn felt like a tomb when he returned. Several cats had crawled into a single carrier, their combined body heat barely keeping them warm. Max, a pit bull rescue with trust issues, pressed against Marcus's leg, the first time the dog had ever sought comfort from a human. "I know, buddy," Marcus said, scratching behind Max's ears. "We're going to fix this." He began assembling the device by flashlight, muscle memory guiding his hands through connections he'd made countless times before. The resonance chambers locked into place with satisfying clicks, the crystalline matrices humming with potential energy as they aligned. This was either salvation or suicide, and Marcus realized he'd passed the point where the distinction mattered. As the final components slotted home, the device began to emit a low, almost subsonic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus stepped back, his finger hovering over the activation switch, knowing that once he pressed it, there would be no going back to his quiet life of anonymity. The wind howled like a dying animal as Marcus dragged the last of the emergency blankets from the storage shed. Snow whipped horizontally across the compound, and even with his goggles, he could barely see 10 feet ahead. The thermometer outside the main barn read negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. Inside the barn, 37 animals huddled together in whatever warmth they could find. The heating system had failed completely now, its pipes frozen solid despite his desperate attempts to keep them flowing. The backup propane heaters were running on fumes, maybe another hour at most before they'd sputter out entirely. Marcus moved between the enclosures, checking on each animal with practiced efficiency. The 3-legged wolf, Luna, pressed against the bars of her pen, her breath forming ice crystals in the air. The blind bear, Samson, had curled into the tightest ball possible, but Marcus could see the tremors running through his massive frame. Worst of all were the smaller animals, the foxes, raccoons, and injured birds whose bodies simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive what was coming. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Luna, scratching behind her ears through the chain link. I should have had a better backup plan. The satellite phone crackled from his pocket. He'd been checking it obsessively for the past 2 hours, hoping for word that the storm was weakening, that rescue vehicles could get through. Instead, the automated weather service delivered another blow. The blizzard was intensifying, with winds expected to reach 70 miles per hour by midnight. No one was coming. No one could come. Marcus slumped against Luna's pen, his mind racing through possibilities he'd already exhausted. He could try to move the animals to the house, but it wasn't built for this many creatures, and the stress of relocation might kill the more fragile ones. He could attempt to reach town on foot, but that was suicide in these conditions, and even if he survived, help wouldn't arrive in time. That left only one option, the option he'd sworn never to consider. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a file buried deep in his encrypted folders. The blueprints appeared on screen, equations and diagrams that had once been worth billions of dollars to NASA, to the military, to anyone willing to pay for revolutionary technology. The same technology that had destroyed his career when the ethics committee deemed it too dangerous for human testing, the resonance heat array, RA. Marcus had spent 3 years developing it in a black-budget program that officially didn't exist. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, used targeted electromagnetic frequencies to excite molecular motion in specific materials, generating heat without combustion, without fuel, without any traditional energy source. The efficiency rates were impossible according to conventional physics, which was exactly why the program had been shut down. But Marcus knew it worked. He'd seen it work. The problem was the side effects. When they'd tested it on a larger scale, strange things had happened. Electronics within a half-mile radius had malfunctioned. Compasses spun wildly, and there had been reports, unconfirmed but troubling, of unusual seismic activity in the area. The military had wanted to weaponize it immediately. NASA had wanted to study it for decades. Marcus had wanted to destroy it entirely, which was why he'd been labeled a security risk and quietly forced into early retirement with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. But he'd kept copies of everything, just in case. Thunder crashed overhead, an ominous sound during a snowstorm. Marcus felt the barn shudder around him, and several of the animals whimpered in fear. Time was running out. He opened another file, this one containing an inventory of materials he'd been slowly gathering over the past 2 years. Copper wiring, rare earth magnets, specialized circuit boards, all purchased separately from different suppliers using cash and false names. Anyone looking at the individual components would see harmless electronics supplies. Put together, they formed something that could change the laws of physics. The device itself was hidden in the basement of his house, disguised as a ham radio setup. It would take him 20 minutes to reconfigure it for heat generation, another 10 to position the resonance nodes around the barn. The power requirements were minimal. His backup generator could handle it easily. But once he activated it, there would be no hiding what it was. The energy signature was unique, unmistakable to anyone with the right equipment. And after what had happened in Nevada, after the cover-up and the congressional hearings he'd never been allowed to attend, Marcus knew they were still watching for any sign that RHA technology had survived. Luna whined softly, pressing her nose against his hand. Around the barn, the other animals looked at him with trusting eyes, completely dependent on his protection. Marcus closed the phone and stood up. Some choices weren't really choices at all. He headed for the house, the storm swallowing his footsteps as he walked toward the basement and the machine that would either save them all or destroy the quiet life he'd built in these mountains. The wind hit the cabin like a freight train, rattling every board and sending Marcus stumbling backward from the window. Outside, the world had disappeared into a white void so complete it seemed like the edge of existence itself. The thermometer mounted beside the door read -18 and falling. "Okay, think," he muttered, pacing the cramped living room. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, already losing its battle against the cold seeping through every crack and crevice. His breath formed small clouds as he spoke to himself, a habit he'd developed during the long isolation. The animals in the barn were depending on him. Rosie, the three-legged German shepherd he'd pulled from a roadside ditch, the family of raccoons whose mother had been hit by a truck, 2 owls with damaged wings, a deer with a shattered leg that was finally healing. All of them would be dead by morning if he didn't find a way to heat that barn. Marcus dropped into his desk chair and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with calculations and sketches that would have made his former NASA colleagues either laugh or call the authorities. Maybe both. The formulas stared back at him, elegant in their simplicity, terrifying in their implications. The prototype sat in the basement, wrapped in canvas like a guilty secret. He'd told himself 1,000 times he'd only built it as an intellectual exercise, a way to prove the theory could work. But deep down, he'd always known this moment would come. When the conventional solutions failed and lives hung in the balance, he would have to choose between safety and salvation. A sharp crack from outside made him jump. A tree branch, probably, succumbing to the ice building on its limbs. The sound reminded him of the day his world had collapsed at NASA, when Director Harrison had slammed the report down on the conference table so hard it had echoed through the room like a gunshot. Reckless, Harrison had called him. Dangerous. The committee had used words like theoretical and unproven and potentially catastrophic. They'd stripped him of his clearance, his position, his reputation, all because he'd dared to suggest that the laws of physics might be more flexible than they'd assumed. But the animals didn't care about his past disgrace or the committee's fears. They needed heat, and conventional methods weren't going to cut it. The backup generator had enough fuel for maybe 6 hours, and the portable heaters he'd managed to set up in the barn were already struggling against the brutal cold. Marcus closed his eyes and made the calculation one more time. The device would need to run for approximately 8 hours to generate enough ambient heat to keep the barn above freezing. The energy signature would be minimal, almost undetectable, unless someone knew exactly what to look for. And in this weather, in this remote location, who would be looking? He stood and walked to the basement door, his hand hovering over the handle. Once he fired up the device, there would be no going back. If it worked, he'd save the animals but risk exposure. If it failed, or worse, if it worked too well, the consequences could extend far beyond his small mountain sanctuary. The wind shrieked again, and he heard something metallic tear loose from the barn roof. Time was running out. Marcus yanked open the basement door and descended into the darkness, his flashlight beam dancing across the concrete walls. The device waited in the corner, innocuous under its canvas shroud, about the size of a microwave oven, with a tangle of custom electronics and several components that had cost him 3 months of his NASA pension to acquire through unofficial channels. He pulled away the canvas and ran his fingers over the smooth metal housing. The theory was sound, the engineering solid. He'd run every simulation, checked every calculation. The energy conversion rate should be stable, the heat output controllable. Should be. Sometimes, the most ridiculous ideas are the most brilliant, he whispered, echoing the words his mentor had spoken years ago, back when Marcus still believed the universe held infinite possibilities for those brave enough to explore them. He connected the power cables and activated the startup sequence. A low hum filled the basement, growing stronger as the device came online. The display showed green across all systems, energy levels building toward operational parameters. Marcus hefted the device and climbed back upstairs, his heart pounding with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Through the kitchen window, he could barely make out the dim outline of the barn, a shadow against the howling white. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped the device in a waterproof tarp, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stinging his exposed skin, but he pushed forward, one step at a time, carrying his dangerous salvation toward the animals who needed him to be brave enough to try the impossible. The temperature gauge read -42 degrees and falling. Marcus stared at the digital display, his breath forming crystals that fell like tiny stars in the lantern light. 3 hours until dawn, and the propane wouldn't last another hour. The animals had gone quiet, never a good sign. He pressed his ear to the barn wall. Usually he could hear the shuffle of hooves, the soft snorts of the horses, maybe Luna's occasional whimper as she dreamed. Now there was only the howling wind and the ominous creaking of wood under the weight of accumulated snow. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "Okay." Marcus pulled the tarp away from the corner, where he'd hidden his real work. Not the simple meteorological instruments he'd shown Dr. Chen, but the device that had cost him everything, the reason he'd fled to these mountains in the first place. The electromagnetic field generator looked innocuous enough. A cylinder about the size of a coffee can, wrapped in copper coiling and connected to a series of batteries he'd modified with parts salvaged from old satellites. The mathematics had been sound. The theory was revolutionary. The results had been catastrophic. He'd called it Project Warmth during his NASA days, back when he'd been Dr. Marcus Chen instead of the hermit of Blackrock Ridge. The idea was simple: use targeted electromagnetic fields to excite molecular motion in a controlled area, essentially heating from the inside out. It could revolutionize space exploration, make Mars habitable, save lives in disaster zones. The prototype had worked perfectly in controlled laboratory conditions. Then came the demonstration for the department heads. What should have been a gentle warming of a test chamber had instead created a localized thermal event that melted through 3 floors of the research facility and hospitalized 2 colleagues with severe burns. The investigation that followed revealed unauthorized experiments, safety protocol violations, and what they'd termed reckless endangerment of personnel. Marcus ran his fingers along the device's surface. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the calibration, understanding where he'd gone wrong. The original failure hadn't been in the theory, it had been in the power regulation. Too much energy, too fast, with no way to modulate the field intensity once initiated. A sound from outside made him freeze, not the wind this time, but something else, a rhythmic thumping against the barn door. Marcus grabbed the lantern and rushed to the entrance. When he pulled the door open, snow cascaded inward, and Hemingway the goat stumbled into the barn, his legs barely supporting him. Ice caked the animal's beard and flanks. His eyes rolled white with hypothermia. No, no, no. Marcus caught the goat before he collapsed. Hemingway's body felt cold as stone, his breathing shallow and irregular. "Stay with me, buddy." He carried Hemingway deeper into the barn, where the other animals huddled together for warmth. Maya raised her head weakly, her usually bright eyes dull with cold. The chickens had stopped moving entirely, whether from cold or death he couldn't tell. Even Rex, the massive draft horse who'd survived neglect and abuse before Marcus found him, stood with his head hanging low, ice forming around his nostrils. The propane heater sputtered. The flame flickered blue, then yellow, then died. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. In the sudden darkness, he could hear his own breathing, rapid and panicked. These animals had trusted him. They'd come to him broken, abandoned, nearly dead, and he'd promised them safety. He'd promised them a home. He thought about Dr. Chen's words from earlier: sometimes the most ridiculous ideas are the most brilliant. Marcus clicked on his headlamp and returned to the electromagnetic device. His hands moved automatically, checking connections, adjusting the power flow regulators he'd installed after the NASA disaster. The mathematics scrolled through his mind: frequency modulation, energy dispersion patterns, thermal coefficients for organic tissue. He'd run the calculations 1,000 times during sleepless mountain nights. He knew exactly how much power to use, how to create a gentle, sustained warming field instead of the violent thermal burst that had destroyed his career. But knowing the math and trusting it in a life-or-death situation were 2 different things. Hemingway whimpered in his arms, the sound barely audible above the storm. Marcus carried the device to the center of the barn and began positioning the field generators he'd built as backup units. If he was going to do this, he needed even heat distribution, no hotspots, no power surges. The animals' lives depended on precision. As he worked, he caught Luna watching him with intelligent brown eyes. She alone seemed alert still, her thick coat providing better insulation than the others had. Her tail thumped once against the straw, not strong, but deliberate. "You trust me, don't you, girl?" Marcus whispered. He powered up the first generator. The familiar hum filled the barn, a sound that once represented his greatest achievement and his most devastating failure. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains as the storm intensified. Marcus reached for the activation switch. The morning brought a deathly silence that Marcus had never experienced before. No birds, no wind through the pines, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the rescued animals seemed to sense something ominous approaching, huddling closer together in their makeshift shelters. Marcus stepped outside his cabin and immediately felt the temperature drop hit him like a physical blow. His breath crystallized instantly, and the moisture in his nostrils began to freeze. The sky had turned an ominous gray-green color that he recognized from his meteorology training at NASA, the kind of sky that preceded something catastrophic. His weather radio crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. National Weather Service has issued a blizzard warning for the Rocky Mountain region. Temperatures expected to drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour. This is a life-threatening weather event. Seek shelter immediately. Marcus calculated quickly in his head. The emergency generators he'd rigged could maybe last 12 hours in these conditions. The animals, 3 bears, a pack of wolves, 2 injured eagles, and dozens of smaller creatures would start dying within 6 hours of losing heat. The conventional heating systems he'd cobbled together from salvaged equipment simply weren't designed for this kind of extreme cold. He stood there for a moment, watching his breath form ice crystals in the air, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Then his eyes drifted to the sealed bunker hidden beneath the false floor of his workshop. For 3 years he'd sworn he would never touch that technology again. The resonance heating array was brilliant, revolutionary, and absolutely forbidden. The patents had been classified, the research buried, and Marcus himself had been quietly forced out of NASA when he'd refused to weaponize his discovery. The first snowflakes began to fall, fat, heavy flakes that meant business. Marcus ran back to his workshop and pulled up the hidden floor panels. The array components lay in pristine condition, protected by vacuum-sealed containers. Crystalline matrices that could generate targeted heat through quantum resonance, requiring no fuel, no combustion, no traditional energy source. Just precise electromagnetic frequencies that could warm living tissue at the cellular level without harming it. The military applications had been obvious and terrifying, a weapon that could cook enemies from the inside while leaving everything else untouched. Marcus had destroyed his research notes and fled to these mountains rather than let his life's work become an instrument of death. But now, staring at the components, he saw only salvation. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over as he began assembling the array. The crystalline resonators clicked together with satisfying precision, each piece fitting perfectly despite years of storage. The control matrix powered up with a soft blue glow, and Marcus felt that familiar thrill of working with technology that pushed the boundaries of known science. The wind outside began to howl, and he could hear the animals growing restless in their shelters. Time was running out. Marcus calibrated the frequency generators to target mammalian and avian cellular structures specifically. Too low, and the heating would be ineffective. Too high, and he'd cook every living thing within a quarter-mile radius. The calculations had to be perfect. He paused, his finger hovering over the activation switch. Once he powered this up, there would be no hiding what he'd done. The energy signature would be detectable by anyone looking for it, and there were definitely people looking for it. The same government agents who'd made his life hell 3 years ago would come running the moment their satellites detected those unique electromagnetic frequencies. Outside, he heard one of the bear cubs crying, a sound of distress that cut through his hesitation like a knife. Marcus flipped the switch. The array hummed to life with an almost musical tone, and immediately the temperature in the workshop began to rise. Not the harsh, dry heat of conventional systems, but a gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to emanate from within his own body. The resonance frequencies were targeting the water molecules in his cells, generating heat at the most fundamental level. He quickly ran outside to check on the animals. In the wolf enclosure, the pack had stopped their anxious pacing and were settling down comfortably, despite the fact that snow was now falling heavily. The bear cubs had stopped crying and were actually playing, seemingly oblivious to the deadly cold that was descending around them. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The technology worked even better than he'd hoped. The animals were being kept warm without any visible heating apparatus, without any fuel consumption, without any of the noise and maintenance issues of conventional systems. But even as he celebrated this small victory, he knew he'd just signed his own death warrant. By tomorrow, maybe sooner, his location would be compromised. The very technology that would save his animals would ultimately destroy the sanctuary he'd built. The blizzard was just beginning, and Marcus had perhaps hours before his past caught up with him. The temperature gauge read -32 degrees and dropping. Marcus watched the mercury plummet as the wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles. The emergency heaters had failed an hour ago, their circuits overwhelmed by the power fluctuations from the storm. Now only the backup propane units stood between his animals and hypothermia, and those tanks were running dangerously low. Bella, the three-legged German shepherd, whimpered from her corner where she huddled with two rescued cats. The old horse, Chester, stood motionless near the far wall, his breath forming thick clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the frigid air. Marcus counted 17 animals in total, each one depending on him to keep them alive through the night. He pulled out his phone and checked the weather report again, though he already knew what it would say. The blizzard wouldn't break until dawn, maybe later. The road to town was impassable, and even if it weren't, no veterinarian would risk the drive in these conditions. He was on his own. Marcus walked to the center of the barn and stared up at the rafters, his mind racing through calculations he'd hoped never to make outside of a laboratory. The prototype sat in the underground workshop, barely 50 yards away, but might as well have been on the moon in this weather. He'd spent 3 years perfecting the quantum resonance heating system, a technology that could revolutionize energy distribution, but would also make him the most wanted man in America if certain people discovered what he'd created. The cats were shivering now, their small bodies struggling to generate enough warmth. Chester's legs trembled, and Marcus knew the old horse wouldn't last much longer in these conditions. He had maybe 2 hours before the situation became critical, maybe less. He grabbed a heavy coat and fought his way through the snow to the workshop entrance, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet twice. The hidden door was frozen shut, and he had to use a crowbar to break the ice seal. Inside, emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across banks of equipment that represented his life's work and his greatest shame. The quantum heating unit stood in the corner like a metallic altar, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It looked deceptively simple, a collection of crystalline chambers connected by superconducting cables, the whole apparatus no larger than a microwave oven. But Marcus knew the power it contained, the elegant manipulation of subatomic particles that could generate heat without combustion, without traditional energy sources, without leaving any trace that conventional science could explain. He'd discovered the principle by accident while working on deep space propulsion systems for NASA. The initial tests had been promising, revolutionary even, but when he'd presented his findings to the review board, everything had changed. Within a week, his security clearance was revoked, his research classified beyond his own access level, and his career destroyed by whispers of mental instability and falsified data. They'd wanted to weaponize it, of course. A heating system that could work anywhere, that required no fuel and produced no emissions, could easily be reverse-engineered into something far more dangerous. Marcus had refused to cooperate, destroyed his official research, and disappeared into these mountains with only the prototype and his memories of the equations. But now, watching ice crystals form on the workshop walls despite the insulation, he realized his self-imposed exile might be ending. The animals needed warmth, and he was the only one who could provide it. The consequences would have to wait. Marcus wheeled the heating unit onto a cart and secured it with bungee cords. The journey back to the barn felt like crossing an Arctic wasteland, the snow stinging his face and the wind threatening to overturn the cart with each gust. By the time he reached the barn door, his hands were numb and his lungs burned from the cold air. Inside, the situation had deteriorated. Two of the smaller animals, a rabbit and a ferret, were barely responsive, their breathing shallow and rapid. Chester had lain down, which was never a good sign for a horse in winter conditions. Marcus had perhaps 30 minutes before he started losing them. He positioned the quantum unit in the center of the barn and ran the power cables to a small generator he kept for emergencies. His hands shook as he initiated the startup sequence, entering the activation codes he'd memorized 3 years ago. The crystalline chambers began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with the fundamental forces that held matter together. Heat began to radiate from the unit, not the harsh blast of a forced air system, but a gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to emerge from the air itself. The temperature gauge stopped falling, held steady for a moment, then began to climb. The animals stirred, lifting their heads as life-giving warmth spread through the barn. Marcus sat down heavily on a hay bale and watched his secret save the lives that mattered most to him. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether this moment of compassion was worth the price he might have to pay. The compound hummed with an energy Marcus had never heard before. Every metal surface vibrated with a low, almost musical frequency that seemed to resonate in his bones. The Tesla coil array he'd jury-rigged from salvaged satellite components was working beyond his wildest calculations, but the sight outside made his stomach clench with dread. The blizzard had intensified overnight. Snow fell so thick he couldn't see past the nearest animal enclosures, and the wind howled like something alive and furious. The backup generators had failed 3 hours ago, leaving only his experimental heating system standing between 47 rescued animals and certain death. Sarah pressed her face against the frosted window of the main building. "Marcus, the temperature's dropping faster than your projections. We're at -32 and falling." He didn't respond immediately, too focused on the readouts dancing across his improvised control panel. The resonance frequency was holding steady, but the power draw was astronomical. At this rate, he'd burn through his entire fuel supply by dawn, and the storm wasn't expected to break for another 18 hours. "The wolves are huddling together, but they're showing signs of hypothermia," Sarah continued, her voice tight with worry. "And the big cats, Marcus, I don't think they'll make it through the night." A sharp crack echoed through the building as one of the Tesla coils overloaded. Sparks cascaded in brilliant blue arcs before the safety systems kicked in, automatically rerouting power through the remaining arrays. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, compensating for the lost capacity. "We need to increase the field strength," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "But if I push it too hard—" "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah moved away from the window, her eyes fixed on his face. "This technology, it's not just some brilliant improvisation, is it? You've been working on this for years." Marcus felt the familiar weight of his secret pressing down on him. For 3 years he'd hidden the truth about why NASA had really terminated his employment. They hadn't fired him for being difficult or unconventional. They'd fired him because his research into resonance-based energy fields had accidentally stumbled onto something that violated everything the scientific community thought they knew about thermodynamics. Another alarm chimed. The heating elements in the bare enclosure were failing. "I have to tell you something," Marcus said, his fingers dancing across the controls as he spoke. "But first, help me route auxiliary power to Sector 7. Sarah grabbed a tablet and pulled up the power grid schematic. "Talk while you work." "The heating system. It's not just converting electrical energy to thermal energy. It's tapping into something else entirely. He paused, watching the readouts climb into dangerous territory. 0-point energy, the quantum vacuum. Sarah's hands stopped moving over the tablet screen. That's impossible. The energy required to extract anything meaningful from quantum fluctuations. Exactly what I discovered by accident 4 years ago. NASA buried the research because they were terrified of the implications. Marcus threw a switch, redirecting power flow. The resonance frequencies I'm using don't just heat the air, they create microtears in space-time that allow thermal energy to bleed through from quantum foam. The building shuddered as wind speeds exceeded 90 miles per hour. Through the storm, Marcus could hear the distressed calls of animals pushed to their biological limits. "Show me," Sarah said quietly. Marcus pulled up his hidden files on the main screen. Equations filled the display, complex mathematical proofs that described the relationship between electromagnetic resonance and quantum energy extraction. Sarah's eyes widened as she absorbed the implications. This is revolutionary. This could solve the global energy crisis, eliminate fossil fuel dependence. She looked up at him. Why hide it? Because the same technology that's keeping our animals alive right now could also be weaponized in ways that would make nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. Marcus highlighted a series of calculations. In the wrong hands, this could destabilize matter at a subatomic level, turn a city block into pure energy in seconds. A new alarm screamed through the building. The main Tesla coil was approaching critical overload. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, studying the power consumption charts. "The conventional heating elements are failing across the compound. If you don't increase the quantum field strength, we'll lose everything anyway." Marcus stared at the controls, knowing that pushing the system beyond its current parameters would create an electromagnetic signature visible to every intelligence agency with proper satellites. His secret would be exposed. Government agents would descend on his sanctuary within hours. But outside, a young mountain lion he'd rescued from illegal poachers was dying slowly in the brutal cold. His hand hovered over the master control, trembling not from the cold but from the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Do it," Sarah whispered. "They trust us to protect them." Marcus closed his eyes and pushed the quantum resonance field to maximum power. Marcus's hands trembled as he made the final connections to the geothermal array. The storm had intensified, beyond anything the Weather Service had predicted, transforming his mountain sanctuary into a frozen wasteland that could claim every life he'd sworn to protect. The conventional heating systems had failed 3 hours ago, and the backup generators were running on fumes. The animals huddled together in the main shelter, their breath forming crystalline clouds in the rapidly cooling air. Bella, the 3-legged German shepherd he'd rescued from a puppy mill, pressed against his leg as he worked. Her trust felt like both a blessing and a crushing weight. "Come on, you beautiful bastard," he whispered to the device that shouldn't exist. The quantum thermal converter represented everything he'd lost and everything he might lose again. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of telling himself he'd destroyed all the research, and here he was assembling it piece by piece from memory. The irony wasn't lost on him. NASA had called his theories impossible, career-ending fantasies that violated fundamental laws of thermodynamics. They'd stripped him of his credentials, leaked stories about his mental instability, and ensured he'd never work in legitimate science again. But impossible theories had a way of becoming lifelines when everything else failed. Sarah appeared at his shoulder, her face pale with cold and worry. The temperature in the recovery ward just dropped to 38 degrees. The premature Fox kits won't last another hour. Those words hit him like a physical blow. He'd pulled those kits from their dying mother just days ago, bottle-feeding them every 2 hours, watching them fight for life with the same stubborn determination that had driven him to this mountain. Losing them now felt like losing everything twice. "How long?" she asked, nodding toward the device. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the quantum resonance chambers need calibration." He caught her confused expression and simplified. Soon. It'll be soon. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The prototype he'd tested at NASA had worked for exactly 47 minutes before catastrophic failure. The theoretical framework was sound, but theory and reality had a complicated relationship when quantum mechanics entered the picture. One miscalculation could turn his heating system into something far more dangerous. The wind howled through gaps in the shelter's construction, carrying with it the promise of death. Marcus had built this place to be a refuge, but nature didn't respect human intentions. The storm seemed almost personal in its intensity, as if the mountain itself was testing his resolve. He inserted the final component, a crystalline matrix he'd grown over months, using techniques that officially didn't exist. The device hummed to life, its internal mechanisms operating on principles that would make his former colleagues question their understanding of physics. Quantum entanglement at the molecular level, thermal energy extraction from apparently empty space, temperature manipulation through dimensional variance. It sounded like science fiction because that's exactly what it was supposed to sound like. Marcus, Sarah's voice carried an edge of panic. Something's happening to the heating vents. He looked up to see waves of distortion rising from the newly activated thermal distributors. The air itself seemed to shimmer and bend, reality becoming negotiable around the points where his impossible device interfaced with the conventional world. This was the part that had terrified NASA, the visual confirmation that they were dealing with something beyond current scientific understanding. "Is it supposed to do that?" Sarah asked. Before he could answer, warmth began flooding the shelter. Not the gradual increase of normal heating, but an immediate, enveloping wave that transformed the space from freezing to comfortable in seconds. The animals stirred, sensing the change, lifting their heads with what looked remarkably like hope. But Marcus watched the readouts with growing alarm. The energy output was climbing beyond safe parameters, the quantum resonance chambers showing instabilities he'd seen before. In 47 minutes, give or take, the device would either stabilize or tear itself apart in ways that would be difficult to explain to investigators. "It's working," Sarah breathed, wonder evident in her voice as she watched the temperature gauges climb into safe ranges. Marcus nodded, unable to share her relief. Success was just the beginning of his problems. The device generated a specific electromagnetic signature that would be visible to anyone monitoring the right frequencies. His former colleagues at NASA would recognize it immediately, and they would come looking for answers he wasn't ready to give. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the shelter, life was winning another round against impossible odds. The fox kits stirred in their warming incubator, and Bella's tail managed a tentative wag. For now, that had to be enough. Marcus settled in to monitor the device's performance, watching the countdown to either salvation or disaster. 47 minutes to decide if saving these lives was worth risking everything he'd built in exile. The quantum thermal converter hummed its impossible song, heating their refuge with energy borrowed from the spaces between atoms, and Marcus prepared for whatever consequences would follow. The storm's fury had reached a crescendo that made Marcus question whether his calculations were even remotely accurate anymore. Wind speeds that should have been impossible at this altitude screamed past the shelter, and the temperature readings on his makeshift instruments had dropped below anything he'd recorded since arriving in these mountains. Inside the main shelter, the animals huddled together in a mass of fur and feathers that broke his heart. The heating system he'd cobbled together from salvaged parts was failing faster than he'd anticipated. Ice crystals were forming on the interior walls despite his best efforts, and he could see his breath in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Luna, the grey wolf he'd rescued 3 months ago, lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that seemed to understand their predicament. Her pack, if he could call this motley collection of rescued wildlife a pack, pressed closer together. The injured falcon he'd been nursing back to health sat motionless on its perch, conserving energy. Even the usually energetic fox kits had stopped their playful movements. Marcus checked his watch. The backup generator had maybe 2 hours of fuel left, and after that, conventional heating would be impossible. The solar panels were buried under 3 feet of snow, and the wind turbine had seized up when ice formed on its bearings. Every practical solution had been exhausted. He pulled the crumpled notebook from his jacket pocket and stared at the equations he'd been avoiding for weeks. The theoretical framework was sound, brilliant even, but the risks were astronomical. If he was wrong about the containment protocols, or if his understanding of the quantum field dynamics was flawed, he wouldn't just lose the animals. The entire mountainside could become uninhabitable for decades. But as Luna's breathing became more labored, and the smaller animals began showing signs of hypothermia, Marcus realized he was out of conventional options. The device sat in the back corner of his workshop, hidden under a canvas tarp like some kind of technological artifact that belonged in a museum rather than a rescue shelter. He'd built it during those dark months after the NASA incident, when his reputation was in ruins and sleep became impossible. It was supposed to be proof of concept, a way to demonstrate that his theories weren't the ravings of a disgraced engineer. Now, as he pulled away the tarp and stared at the collection of precisely machined components and electromagnetic coils, it might be the only thing standing between life and death. The setup took 45 minutes of careful calibration. Each connection had to be perfect, each setting verified against his calculations. There was no room for error, no opportunity for a second attempt if something went wrong. The power requirements alone would drain his remaining battery reserves completely. As he worked, Marcus found himself talking to the animals, explaining what he was doing as if they could understand. "The principle is relatively simple," he said, adjusting a frequency modulator with trembling fingers. "We're not actually generating heat through conventional means. Instead, we're creating a localized field that affects molecular vibration patterns." Luna watched him intently, and he swore he could see skepticism in her expression. "I know how it sounds," he continued, running final diagnostics on the control systems. "But quantum field manipulation isn't magic. It's just physics that most people don't understand yet." The moment of truth arrived faster than he wanted. The conventional heating system gave its last shudder and died, leaving only the emergency lighting powered by his dwindling battery reserves. The temperature began dropping immediately, and he could hear the animals shifting restlessly as the cold pressed in around them. Marcus positioned the device in the center of the shelter and began the startup sequence. The electromagnetic coils hummed to life, creating a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Warning lights flickered on the control panel, indicating power levels that pushed every component beyond its design specifications. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The humming continued. The power consumption climbed toward dangerous levels, and Marcus began to wonder if 3 years of theoretical work had been nothing more than elaborate self-deception. Then the air itself seemed to shimmer. It started as a barely perceptible warmth, like the first hint of sunrise after a long night. The temperature readings on his instruments began climbing slowly, then more rapidly. But there was no visible heat source, no glowing elements or burning fuel. The warmth simply existed, spreading outward from the device in gentle waves that defied every conventional understanding of thermodynamics. Luna lifted her head, ears perked forward in curiosity rather than alarm. The falcon ruffled its feathers and shifted position for the first time in hours. Throughout the shelter, animals began to relax as the life-threatening cold retreated. Marcus monitored the readings with growing amazement and terror. The device was working exactly as his calculations predicted, but seeing theory become reality made the implications impossible to ignore. This technology could revolutionize energy production, eliminate heating costs worldwide, and fundamentally change human civilization. It could also destroy everything he'd built here if the wrong people discovered it. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside the shelter, warmth and hope had returned. The wind screamed against the shelter walls with renewed fury, and Marcus could feel the temperature dropping by the minute. The animals huddled closer together, their breathing visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated too quickly in the frigid air. The backup heaters were failing faster than he'd anticipated, and the solar panels were completely buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Marcus knelt beside Luna, the wolf-dog hybrid who'd been with him the longest. Her normally bright eyes were dulled with cold, and she pressed against him seeking warmth. Around the shelter, 24 other rescued animals, bears, foxes, an injured eagle, even a family of raccoons, had formed a makeshift pack, instinctively sharing body heat. "I know, girl," he whispered, stroking Luna's thick fur. "I'm not giving up on you." But time was running out. The thermometer read -37 degrees Fahrenheit, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The National Weather Service had called it a once-in-a-century blizzard, the kind that turned the Rocky Mountains into a frozen wasteland where nothing survived. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the familiar weight of failure pressing down on him. 3 years ago, his revolutionary plasma heating design had been dismissed by NASA as theoretical nonsense. The review board had laughed at his calculations, called his methodology flawed, and ultimately cost him his career. But they'd been wrong about the science, even if they'd been right about the danger. He opened his eyes and stared at the sealed storage container in the corner of the shelter. Inside lay the components for a miniaturized plasma heating system, the same technology that could have heated entire space stations, the same design that had gotten him exiled to these mountains in disgrace, the same system that had killed 16 people during its first real-to-world test. Marcus stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. The container's lock required both a key and a biometric scan. He'd sworn never to open it again, had buried it so deep in the mountains that he'd hoped no one would ever find it. But now, watching Luna's labored breathing and seeing the frost forming on the whiskers of the sleeping fox cubs, he realized that some promises were meant to be broken. His fingers trembled as he entered the unlock sequence. The scanner read his thumbprint, and the container hissed open with a soft pneumatic sigh. Inside, nested in protective foam, lay what looked like an oversized briefcase covered in heat sinks and warning labels. The Prometheus unit, his life's work and his greatest shame, the device that could generate enough clean heat to warm a building, but which required a quantum containment field so precise that the margin for error was measured in femtoseconds. "What's the worst that could happen?" he muttered to himself with bitter irony. He already knew the answer. Marcus began assembling the system with practiced hands, muscle memory guiding him through steps he'd performed hundreds of times in the lab. The magnetic containment rings locked into place with satisfying clicks. The quantum field generators hummed to life as their batteries engaged. Finally, he positioned the plasma chamber at the center of the shelter, well away from the animals but close enough to provide maximum heat distribution. Luna lifted her head and whined softly, as if sensing the electricity building in the air. Marcus scratched behind her ears reassuringly. "It's okay, girl. Either this works or we all go down together." He powered up the containment field first, watching as invisible magnetic forces created a stable pocket of space, roughly the size of a basketball. The field strength indicators glowed green. So far, so good. Next came the plasma injection system, introducing superheated matter into the containment zone at precisely controlled temperatures. The shelter immediately began to warm. The frost on the walls started melting, and several of the animals stirred from their cold-induced lethargy. Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. It was working, but he knew from bitter experience how quickly things could go wrong. The plasma temperature climbed steadily, 5,000 degrees, 10,000, 15,000. At these temperatures, the plasma glowed like a miniature star, contained only by the magnetic field that Marcus had spent 7 years perfecting. The animals moved away from the bright light instinctively, but already the shelter felt 20 degrees warmer. 20,000 degrees, 25,000. The field strength indicators flickered yellow for a heart-stopping moment before stabilizing back to green. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead, realizing that for the first time in hours he was actually sweating instead of shivering. Around the shelter, the rescued animals were beginning to move normally again. Luna's tail wagged weakly, and the bear cubs started wrestling with each other. But the storm outside continued its assault, and Marcus knew that maintaining the plasma containment in these conditions would require constant monitoring. One power fluctuation, one magnetic field instability, one moment of inattention, and the contained star in the center of his shelter would escape its prison. He settled in for the longest night of his life. The compound erupted into chaos as the first wave of federal agents breached the perimeter. Marcus watched through the control room's reinforced windows as black SUVs carved through the snow, their headlights cutting through the blizzard like angry eyes. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but not now, not when every second counted for the animals huddled in the shelters below. "Sarah, get to the lower levels and keep the heating system running," he shouted over the alarm klaxons. "Whatever happens, don't let those generators fail." She hesitated at the doorway, her face pale but determined. "What about you?" "I'll buy us time." Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard, initiating emergency protocols he'd hoped never to use. The facility's defensive systems hummed to life. Electromagnetic barriers designed to protect sensitive equipment that could now serve a different purpose. The lead agent's voice crackled through the external speakers. "Marcus Chen, this is Agent Rodriguez with the Department of Energy. You're surrounded. Shut down your operation and surrender immediately." Marcus keyed the response microphone. "Agent Rodriguez, I've got 300 animals down here who'll freeze to death in the next hour if I shut down. Give me until the storm passes." "Negative. Intel suggests you're running an illegal fusion reactor. That makes this a national security issue." Through the monitors, Marcus watched the thermal signatures of his beloved rescue animals. The old wolf pack in Shelter 7, the injured eagles in the aviary, dozens of species that had found sanctuary in his mountain refuge. The quantum resonance chamber 3 levels below was the only thing keeping them alive now, its impossible physics generating heat that conventional science said couldn't exist. A new voice cut through the radio chatter. "Marcus, it's Director Hawthorne." His blood turned to ice. Hawthorne, his former supervisor at NASA, the man who'd orchestrated his disgrace after Marcus had refused to weaponize his quantum field research. "I should have known you'd crawl out from whatever rock you've been hiding under," Marcus replied. "You always were brilliant but naive. Did you really think we wouldn't eventually detect the energy signature of your little experiment? Quantum field manipulation on this scale creates ripples we can measure from orbit." Marcus glanced at the power readings. The resonance chamber was operating at 93% efficiency, drawing energy from the quantum foam itself, the seething mass of virtual particles that existed in the vacuum of space. It was technology decades ahead of anything officially acknowledged, born from theories he'd developed in the classified depths of government research. "I'm using it to save lives," Marcus said. "The animals are convenient cover for weapons research," Hawthorne interrupted. "Don't insult my intelligence. A man doesn't disappear into the mountains for 5 years just to play veterinarian." An explosion rocked the facility as the agents breached the outer doors. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as the main power grid fluctuated. Marcus felt the building shudder, heard the distant sound of boots on metal stairs. Sarah's voice crackled through the intercom. "Marcus, the quantum chamber is holding steady, but the conventional backup systems are failing. If they cut power to the primary cooling loops..." She didn't need to finish. Marcus understood the nightmare scenario. Without proper cooling, the quantum field would destabilize catastrophically. The energy release would vaporize everything within a 5-mile radius and irradiate half the state. It was the exact nightmare that had driven him to hide his research in the first place. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the control room. Marcus made a decision that would have terrified him 5 years ago, but now seemed as natural as breathing. He activated the quantum field's secondary function, not just heat generation, but matter manipulation at the subatomic level. The reinforced door began to shift, its molecular structure flowing like liquid while maintaining its strength. When the agents reached it, they would find something that appeared normal, but would resist any attempt at entry for at least an hour. "You're making this worse for yourself." Hawthorne's voice carried a note of genuine concern beneath the authority. "We know what that technology is capable of. Help us control it before someone gets hurt." "Control it?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You mean weaponize it? Turn it into another tool for destruction?" He thought of Luna, the Arctic fox whose bright eyes had watched him work these past months, trusting him to keep her warm and safe. "I found a better use." The building shuddered again as more agents flooded the lower levels. Sarah's voice reported increasing strain on the quantum chamber's containment systems. Outside, the blizzard raged with undiminished fury, nature itself seeming to take sides in this confrontation between past and present, between the man Marcus had been and the guardian he'd become. He pulled up the facility's master control interface, his hands steady despite everything falling apart around him. One way or another, this would end tonight. The only question was whether anyone, human or animal, would survive to see morning. The wind screamed through the gaps in the barn walls like a banshee, carrying ice crystals that stung Marcus's face as he worked frantically to connect the final circuit. His hands, numb despite the insulated gloves, fumbled with the delicate wiring of the quantum resonance chamber he'd been perfecting for 3 years in secret. "Come on," he muttered through chattering teeth, watching his breath form crystalline clouds in the sub-zero air. Around him, the rescued animals huddled together for warmth, elderly horses, abandoned dogs, injured wildlife he'd been nursing back to health. Their eyes followed his every movement with a trust that made his chest tighten with responsibility. The chamber itself looked like something cobbled together from a junkyard. Salvaged satellite components welded to recycled heat exchangers, all powered by a modified fusion cell he'd borrowed from NASA before his very public disgrace. To anyone else, it would appear to be the desperate delusion of a man who'd lost everything. But Marcus knew better. The theoretical framework was sound, even if it challenged everything the scientific community believed about thermodynamics. Sarah burst through the barn door, snow swirling around her like a personal blizzard. "The weatherman's calling it a 100-year storm," she shouted over the wind. "Temperatures dropping to -40, maybe lower. We've got maybe 2 hours before—" She stopped, staring at the contraption Marcus was assembling. "What the hell is that?" Marcus didn't look up from his work. "Emergency heating system." "That's not a heating system, that's a—" Sarah moved closer, her veterinarian's eye picking out familiar components among the chaos. "Marcus, are those NASA components? Please tell me you didn't steal government property." "I didn't steal anything." Technically true, he'd removed the equipment before officially leaving the program, though he doubted his former supervisors would see it that way. And right now, this ridiculous contraption is the only thing standing between these animals and freezing to death. A violent gust shook the barn, and somewhere above them, a roof beam creaked ominously. In the corner, the old mare whinnied nervously, her breath creating dense fog clouds. The conventional heating system had failed an hour ago, and the backup generators were already struggling against the cold. Sarah watched him work, her expression cycling through confusion, fear, and something that might have been admiration. "You want to tell me how this thing is supposed to work?" Marcus hesitated. Once he activated the chamber, there would be no hiding what he'd been working on. The energy signatures alone would be detectable from orbit, and it wouldn't take long for someone at NASA to put the pieces together. His quiet exile would be over, replaced by congressional hearings, criminal charges, and very possibly a lifetime in federal prison. But as he looked at the animals depending on him, creatures who'd already been abandoned once and deserved better than freezing to death in a Colorado blizzard, the choice became simple. "Quantum resonance heating," he said, making final adjustments to the field generators. "Instead of burning fuel to create heat, we tap into the quantum field fluctuations that exist at the subatomic level. Essentially, we're borrowing energy from the universe itself." Sarah stared at him. "That's impossible." So was human flight, until it wasn't. Marcus activated the initialization sequence, and the chamber began to hum with barely contained energy. The math works, Sarah. I've run the calculations 1,000 times. The only reason NASA won't pursue it is because it threatens too many existing energy contracts. The humming intensified, and strange lights began to dance within the crystalline core of the device. Marcus held his breath, watching readouts that meant nothing to Sarah but everything to him. Quantum field density was climbing. Energy cascade was holding steady. The resonance frequency was... Marcus. Sarah's voice was tight with worry. The air is getting warm. She was right. Despite the howling wind outside and the gaps in the barn walls, the temperature was rising. Not the dry, artificial heat of electric coils, but something deeper and more fundamental, as if the very molecules of air were being energized from within. The animals felt it too. The mare stopped her nervous pacing. The dogs lifted their heads from their tight huddle. Even the injured hawk in its recovery cage stretched its wings, sensing the change in atmosphere. "It's working," Marcus whispered, hardly daring to believe it. 3 years of theoretical work, of sleepless nights and failed prototypes, and finally, his satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message, then another, and another. Sarah peered over his shoulder at the screen. Multiple contacts from NASA headquarters, Defense Department, and... She paused. "Who's Director Vance?" Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the name. NSA. They must have detected the energy signature. He looked around the warm barn, at the animals that were already beginning to relax as life-saving heat filled the space. "We've got maybe 30 minutes before the helicopters arrive." The quantum chamber hummed peacefully, saving lives with every second of operation. But outside, Marcus could hear something else beneath the wind, the distant thrum of approaching aircraft. His secret was out. The quantum field stabilized at 37 degrees Celsius, and Marcus felt his knees buckle with relief. Around him, the rescued animals began to stir from their cold-induced lethargy. The 3-legged dog lifted his head, tail wagging weakly. The blind cat stretched and mewed softly. Even the injured hawk ruffled its feathers with something approaching contentment. But his relief lasted exactly 14 seconds. The radio crackled to life with Diane's voice, sharp with urgency. "Marcus, we've got company. 3 black SUVs just turned off the main highway. They're heading up the mountain road." His blood turned to ice water. After 18 months of hiding, they'd found him. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. 20 minutes, maybe less if they have chains. Marcus looked around the barn, at the dozens of animals depending on him. The quantum heating system hummed quietly in the corner, its impossible physics keeping them all alive. He could shut it down, destroy the evidence, and run. He'd planned for this moment countless times. But the 3-legged dog was looking at him with absolute trust, and the premature foals were finally breathing easily in their makeshift stalls. "Marcus," Sarah's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, snow melting in her dark hair. "I know what you're thinking. Don't do it. You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand perfectly." She stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "You think you have to choose between protecting your secret and protecting these animals. But maybe there's a third option." Before he could ask what she meant, Diane's voice crackled through again. "Marcus, you need to hear this. I'm picking up their radio chatter. They're not just looking for you. They're looking for the technology. Something about a failed weapons program and stolen classified research." Marcus felt the world tilt. Weapons program? That's what they're saying. Project Prometheus. Ring any bells? It rang more than bells. It triggered a cascade of memories that made him sick. The late-night meetings with military contractors, the questions about scaling up the quantum field generators, the moment he'd realized what they really wanted to do with his clean energy research. That's why he destroyed his lab and fled to the mountains. "They want to weaponize it," he whispered. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Then we don't let them have it. The only way to stop them is to destroy everything, including the heating system keeping these animals alive. Or," Sarah said, pulling out her phone, We give them something else to worry about. Before Marcus could stop her, she was dialing. Hello, is this Channel 7 News? This is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Colorado Wildlife Rescue. I have an incredible story about a revolutionary heating technology that's saving dozens of animals in the worst blizzard in state history. Marcus stared at her. What are you doing? Making it impossible for them to cover this up, she said, then spoke back into the phone. Yes, I said revolutionary technology, and if you want the exclusive, you better get your news crew up here in the next 15 minutes. Diane's voice came through the radio again. Marcus, the SUV's just hit the switchback, 10 minutes out, but wait, I'm seeing something else on the scanner. Local sheriff's department is responding to reports of federal agents operating without local notification, and there's a news van racing up Highway 6. Marcus felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. You're insane. Sometimes insane is the only sane response, Sarah replied. You spent 2 years hiding because you thought no one would understand. But maybe it's time to trust people with the truth. The quantum field generator hummed louder as Marcus pushed it to maximum output. If he was going to do this, he wanted every animal in the barn as warm and comfortable as possible. Diane, he said into the radio, patch me through to whoever's leading that federal convoy. Marcus, what are you? Just do it. Static filled the air, then a cold official voice. Dr. Marcus Webb, this is Agent Harrison, Department of Energy. You're in possession of classified technology. Agent Harrison, Marcus replied, checking his watch. In about 5 minutes, this location is going to be crawling with reporters, sheriff's deputies, and probably a few very photogenic rescued animals. You can try to seize technology that's currently keeping injured wildlife alive during a natural disaster, or you can sit down with me tomorrow and discuss the peaceful applications of quantum field theory over coffee. Long silence. Then, stand down, units. We'll reassess the situation. Sarah squeezed his hand. Think they'll actually leave you alone? Marcus looked around the barn at the animals, warm, safe and alive, then at the impossible machine humming in the corner. Probably not forever, but maybe long enough to change the conversation. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the barn, the temperature held steady at a perfect 72 degrees. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the morning sun. Marcus stood in the doorway of the main shelter, watching his animals venture cautiously into the snow. The bears emerged first, their thick coats steaming in the crisp air, followed by the wolves who bounded through the drifts with playful energy. Even the injured eagle perched on a nearby post, its wing healing well. 3 days had passed since he'd activated the geothermal system, and the compound hummed with quiet efficiency. Underground pipes circulated heated water through every building, maintaining perfect temperatures while remaining completely invisible to satellite surveillance. The animals were thriving, the shelters were warm, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt something approaching peace. That feeling shattered when he spotted the figures moving through the trees. 4 people in winter gear were making their way up the mountain trail, moving with purpose despite the difficult terrain. Marcus's heart hammered as he recognized the lead figure's distinctive gait, Sarah Chen, his former colleague from NASA's propulsion lab. Behind her walked 2 men he didn't recognize, and bringing up the rear was Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the Ethics Committee. They'd found him. Marcus quickly secured the animals in their shelters and activated the emergency protocols he'd hoped never to use. Hidden panels slid over the geothermal vents, camouflage generators kicked in to mask the system's energy signature, and the compound transformed back into what appeared to be a simple wildlife sanctuary powered by conventional means. By the time Sarah and her team reached the main gate, Marcus had composed himself enough to greet them with studied calm. "Marcus," Sarah said, pulling back her hood. Her breath formed white clouds as she spoke. "You're a hard man to find. I like my privacy," he replied, not moving to unlock the gate. "What brings you all the way up here?" Dr. Warren stepped forward, her expression stern but not unkind. "You know why we're here, Marcus. The energy signatures, the thermal anomalies our satellites have been detecting, We need to talk. About what? My heating bills? One of the men Marcus didn't recognize, tall, angular, with government written all over him, pulled out a tablet. Dr. Webb, we have evidence of unauthorized energy generation at this location. Energy patterns consistent with classified research you were involved with before your departure from NASA. Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Behind the compound's walls, his animals waited in their warm shelters, alive because of the technology these people considered dangerous. The same technology that could revolutionize energy production worldwide if used responsibly. The cats are sleeping, he said quietly. The bears are hibernating properly for the first time since I rescued them. The wolf pack has a warm den for their new pups. You want to shut that down? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Marcus, we're not here to hurt the animals, but the technology you're using, if it's what we think it is, it's too dangerous to operate without oversight. Dangerous? Marcus laughed, the sound bitter in the cold air. Sarah, I've been running this system for 6 months. 0 incidents, 0 containment issues, 0 environmental impact. The only thing it's killed is my electric bill. And if something goes wrong, Dr. Warren asked, if the quantum resonance cascade fails catastrophically, you could level half the mountain. Marcus studied their faces, seeing a mixture of fear, curiosity, and determination. They'd come expecting to find a rogue scientist playing with forces beyond his control. Instead, they'd found a working proof of concept that challenged everything they thought they knew about energy safety. You want to see it, he said finally. It wasn't a question. The government man, Agent Patterson, he'd introduced himself, nodded curtly. Full disclosure, Dr. Webb, everything. Marcus unlocked the gate and led them through the compound. Animals watched curiously from their enclosures as the group passed. He stopped at the main shelter and activated a hidden panel, revealing the elegant control interface beneath. Quantum-enhanced geothermal tapping, he explained, as readouts flickered to life. The resonance field amplifies natural thermal energy by a factor of 12, with built-in safety protocols that make cascade failure mathematically impossible. Sarah stared at the displays, her scientific mind clearly racing. The energy output is incredible, but these containment readings... Marcus, how did you solve the quantum decoherence problem? By thinking smaller instead of bigger, he replied. NASA wanted to power cities. I just wanted to keep some animals warm. Dr. Warren examined the environmental monitors, her eyebrows rising as she processed the data. No beryllium radiation, no toxic byproducts, minimal ground disturbance. This is clean, Agent Patterson finished, sounding almost disappointed. Completely clean. A low rumble from the bear enclosure drew their attention. Maximus was awake, pressing his massive frame against the viewing window and eyeing the newcomers with lazy curiosity. 300 pounds of rescued grizzly, Marcus said. He was dying when I found him. Hypothermia, malnutrition, infected wounds. That was 8 months ago. The bear huffed contentedly and settled back into his warm corner. So, Marcus continued, what happens now?